Rather than calling the brainstem, I'm going to call it the central brain complex. So it includes the brainstem, it includes the thalamus, and it includes the ventricles, because that is kind of how I see it. And when you view it in that way, it really opens up the whole central area of the brain. And I think because of the way it's been labeled, it gets a bit misrepresented energetically. Quite often people refer to the brain stem as I think some people call it the reptilian brain, something like that. I think that is partly to do with the name. It's kind of the stem of the brain rather than the central part of the brain. But also, well, let me show you. I'll show pictures in a minute. I'll describe it first. If you only include what is called the brainstem, it is devoid of the thalamus, which is like the head. The brainstem is like a body. The medulla oblongata is like the legs, the pelvis, the abdomen. The pons in the middle is like the lungs and heart. The midbrain is like the neck. And the thalamus is like the head and contains all of the higher centers. It contains the connection to the higher self. It's surrounded by water. The middle of it is water. So there's an immense possibility for channeling. And it is the whole third eye complex, includes the pituitary gland, includes the pineal gland, the hypothalamus, the very core of our anatomy, and apparently the seat of our consciousness. So yeah, if you take that away from the lower part of it, the lower part will have, if you just tune into that, will have a very lower energy. But if you put the head back on and connect it back up to God or the Creator or the higher self or whatever you want to call it, then those energies are flowing up and down through that whole being, that whole central part of yourself, and the energies completely change. So through the description of it, I feel that it's been misrepresented for purposes of healing. So I've given it a new name, as with the whole of the cranial fluid. I call that the cranial sea, because that has also been misrepresented, and also misrepresented for this area in the center of the brain. And we will look at that with the pictures in a minute, but I'm going to give a little overall description of the other energies we'll be working with and the other organs we'll be working with that include the central brain complex. There we go, I remembered it. It takes a while for me to remember anyone's, especially ones that I've just made up. The anatomy books are probably getting pretty sick of me by now, changing all of their names, but that's just the way it goes. So this is the last in this circuit. We started with the rectum, which is the lower energies for this circuit, but it's also the kundalini. It's where the kundalini rises for this circuit through the sacrum, through the spine, and up through the whole central brain complex. It always reminds me, remember those pictures you see of the old fairgrounds, and they've got the guy with a big sledgehammer and he hits this thing and thing shoots up, and if he hits it hard enough, it bings this bell at the top. That always reminds me a bit of the Kundalini as it releases in the sacrum and it goes up, and if it goes all the way, it lights up the thalamus. You get this bing as it gets to the top. So for this particular circuit, the rectum is the sexual potency that's releasing, and all of the different circuits we have relate to different parts of the pelvis, different parts of the genitalia for that potency that rises up through that circuit. So we started with the rectum. The next part in this circuit is the colon. Now, the rectum and the central brain complex, this is more the vertical and center line through the body. The other two organs are the colon and the lungs, which are lateral. They are the breath. They're opening to the sides. The colon is the size of the abdomen and across the top. The lungs, each side of the chest, and you get this sideways motion to the lungs and the colon. And that is a bit more, for me, it has a more feminine quality. And then when we come together into the rectum, it comes onto the center line, and it automatically releases the energy that's built up in this sideways motion from the rectum through the central brain complex. 1 minute, I'm just going to move something. And in the face, I'll show you the pictures later, it's the maxillary sinus area that is like the lungs for the face, and that relates to this whole circuit. And the sides of the cranium, it's like the lungs for the cranium, that relates to the circuit. But later I will show you all of the points. We'll go through all of the points and where they are and how we will be opening up these different organs from these points. But let's just look at it. So we worked with the rectum and the sexual energies and being able to sit into our being. It's a bit like the thalamus is the seat of consciousness. In a way, the rectum is the seat of our being, to ground and to sit into ourselves. We're sitting down into the rectum area and into the sacrum area, and often with abuse, or definitely sexual abuse, and definitely on little boys, it takes people out of their center through trauma or threat. And by working with the rectum in that area, people get to sit back into themselves and release any kind of abuse, really, that is designed to knock you out of your center so other people can have control over you in one way or another. You start sitting strongly into yourself. So we worked with that. And then the colon is like the breath for the abdomen, and there are all sorts of things we worked with that. The lungs, it's like our breath, and we can hold down our breath, and again it's often through admonishment and different things, or being scared or not wanting to be in our energy, that the lungs get closed down. So we worked with opening that up. And for this session, the emphasis is going to connect to the central brain complex. And not only do all three of those organs culminate into this complex, all of the organs, all of everything connects into this complex. All of the nerve fibers from the cerebellum, from the cerebrum, they all come down into the complex. The energy is travelling as light through the cranial sea and travelling into the thalamus and down through that area, so the whole brain connects to it. And then you've got the spinal cord, which is bringing all of the messages back and forth. The body are going directly up into it. All the facial nerves are coming out of it. The vagus nerve is coming out of it, the nerves for the ears, the eyes, the tongue, all the sensory organs are coming out of it. So this central place in ourselves connects to everything. And I'm working with it this week. I was interested that I was being revisited by a lot of the tiredness and memory of Lyme disease. It was still held as a memory in the central brain complex. And I'm kind of thinking maybe a lot of tiredness diseases somehow get held in that area, or that is kind of part of it. And because you do have the hypothalamus, the pituitary gland, the pineal gland, or all of that in that area, it's not surprising. And with Lyme's disease, it affects that whole area. It affects the immune system, so the immune system can't work. Definitely does something to the hypothalamus, because once you get Lyme's disease, you'll never get a fever again whilst you've still got it, because the Lyme's disease affects that central area of the brain, so you don't get fevers, because if your body gets hot, it will start killing the Lyme's disease. So it tampers with your brain. It also kills the different glial cells and the neurons and all of that stuff, and just really getting the energy going through that central. I could feel the tiredness, I could feel the gripping in the throat, and it was really good just to let that go through and heal. So I think with a lot of long-term illnesses and a lot of conditions, be it illness, positional, traumatic, whatever, I think one of the final places that it registers, or the top of the pyramid, is in this central area before, from the thalamus, where it connects up into the beyond. So with holographic breathing, we work with all of the different areas, how they relate to the brain and how they connect to the higher self. And so if you've got something wrong with your arm, if you just try and fix the arm, maybe it'll get better, maybe it won't. But if you connect that through the whole body, you connect it through the brain, you connect it through the central brain complex, you connect it up to the higher self, you connect it to the earth, suddenly there's a lot better chance that that will resolve itself. So let's look at some pictures. Now I painted these, they've come in really handy. I painted this all about 10 years ago, because I was describing how I saw the cranial seed, because it was shown in all the books in a way that to me made absolutely no sense, and that I didn't experience in that way. And when I looked into it, the science actually backed me up rather than what the books backed up. I started painting pictures of it all to describe it, but they're also very useful for this. Now this shows the center. I'm going to have to look around the side. You know, I can't say these are 100% accurate, but they're good for what we're doing, and they have a certain quality. So this is the cerebellum at the back, but here you have the medulla at the bottom, which is kind of the pelvis, the abdomen, the legs. The pons here, what this is all the nerve tracts from the cerebellum are coming around and wrapping around this area on both sides, so it bulges out here. And the cerebellum is also like a pair of lungs, and this is like the lungs and heart for this central, did I call it the CBC? Much easier to say CBC, for the CBC, the central brain complex, the CBC, because I'm not going to say central brain complex continually for the whole night. So you've got the kind of the lungs and the heart for the CBC. And then you come up, this is the neck area. And what this is, so the pons area, that's all the nerve tracts from the cerebellum. The neck area here, this is all the nerve tracts from, see, this will be one side, one hemisphere of the brain is coming down into this, and the other, rather than the nerve tracts coming down into the thalamus, the top, they don't, they arrive below it. So this is the area that is physically connecting to the cerebrum and the cerebellum. So that kind of got called the brainstem. But that disconnected this, which is the thalamus, which has got all of the higher centers in it. So for me, I'm including all of that, because as soon as you include that, then you get the higher energies flowing up and down. And because of the way I saw it, I wanted to show the ventricles around it, because I saw the cranial fluid actually feeding the thalamus and feeding the whole CBC, rather than just going on this journey around the central nervous system and not being used. I saw the oxygen, the glucose, the salt going to the nearest cells and feed them, as it does everywhere else in the body. So I painted the picture, and it's amazing how it brings it to life. So if you look at that picture, you know, it's okay, so it's nice, it is the CBC. But if you include the ventricles, notice how it brings it to life. Suddenly it's kind of got a whole different energy. And the ventricles aren't normally included as part of the brainstem. They're thought of as part of the brain. They're thought of as this. They're connected to, or that's the lateral brains, they're connected to the brain. There's somehow something to do with the brain. But actually, the lateral ones are connected to the thalamus. They wrap around the thalamus. The third ventricle's in the middle of the thalamus. Then the fourth ventricle drops down inside through the midbrain and through the pons, and then down through the spine. So it really brings it to life as an energy in a picture. And the central track of the CBC, without the ventricles, this more relates to this kundalini that is specific to the rectum, that releases up and that lights up that whole central tract. And then the ventricles and the cranial sea flowing through it, this is more related to the lungs, more this lateral motion. And then when you bring them together, that whole area just lights up. Let's go through a couple more of these pictures. So there you have that central tract inside the cerebrum. It looks nice as it is, and I've done them in watercolours so you can see it's in the middle. That's the cerebellum behind it. But again, when you add the ventricles around it, notice how it gives it a whole new life. It kind of brings it to life. And there is the nerve tracts. You know, what is intelligence and what isn't? You know, people say, oh, it's the neurons and the synapses that are making people intelligent. But as we're finding in the other webinars where we're working with all of the glial cells and brain cells, they're all intelligent. And the cranial sea is intelligent. You know, what exactly is it that's intelligent? Those very same cells in the spinal cord, well, people don't think, well, those cells are thinking, those cells are intelligent, but as soon as they're in the brain, oh yeah, that's my brain, that's where I think. But the cells, they're exactly the same. The cranial sea is exactly the same. It's the position of it. It's the connection to the higher self. It's the connection to the beyond that brings a quality of intelligence. And the intellect isn't the only intelligence. There's the intelligence of the cranial sea, there's the intelligence of the astrocyte cells, there's the intelligence of the myelinating glial cells, there's intelligence of the microglial cells. It's all there. And in this central area, especially around the thalamus, kind of is like the seat of our consciousness. It is a direct connection to the higher self, and you can't divide it up. You can't say, well, this bit is the brainstem and is reptilian and then this top bit, oh, that's the you can't get a bigger divide than that, can you really? This part of the CBD is reptilian, and then this bit is your seat of consciousness. I mean, it is like decapitating somebody, but you bring those together, you get a whole different animal. Then you add the ventricles around it and it opens up in a whole new way as well. Did I just show you it with the brain? I don't know if I showed it with the brain. Anyway, let me just turn that over. Yeah, so anyway, there we have it in the brain, and there we have it with the ventricles in the brain. It was amazing painting these, because I painted them. I thought, well, that's nice. I put the ventricles around. I went, whoa! What happened there? That's amazing. And then it's been decapitated again. It's been divided from the spine. Let's see if I can find those. Sorry. See how when you connect it to the spine, it adds new life to it. It suddenly becomes an alive thing with an earth and a ground. There can be a real disconnect from reality when you start dividing things. So for me, that really gives the whole CBC, a whole earth and a connection to the body. It's not like it can just live on its own. It's like its tail, its root. Okay, so let's carry on. I think that one is best. So I'm not sure if you're going to see a heavy book and wide. I'm going to stand up to do this. So, I'm not sure. Let's do that one. I'm not sure if you can see it properly. See where my thumb is? That is all of the nerve tracts going to the cerebrum there. And then on this one, they've cut through it here. You can see all of the nerve tracts that are coming round from the cerebellum and making the pons. Then in this next one, you can see the red in that next one. That is the choroid plexus, and they're wrapped around the thalamus, they're in the thalamus, and they're in the fourth ventricle at the back of the, just as where the pons is joining, where the cerebellum is joining to the CBC. Now, rather than in anatomy books, the choroid plexus being shown as part of the CBC, the choroid plexus is shown as part of the ventricles and part of the brain. But actually, the choroid plexus is part of, physically, part of that CBC, that whole complex. It is physically part of it, and then the ventricles are coming out of that. And again, I feel like I'm fighting science, because there's this whole weird image that I mean, I've looked at the anatomy, and the choreplexus seems to be between a quarter and a third of the blood supply to the whole brain is going to the choreplexus. So it's a huge amount of blood, and that is creating cranial C, which is full of oxygen, glucose, salt. Now in the anatomy books, it isn't used. It goes in the ventricles, it goes through the thalamus, it goes through the whole CBD, it goes right down to the bottom of the spine, loops around, comes all the way back up the spine, goes around the whole head, and then leaves through the venous sinus. The venous sinus is designed to take venous blood away. There's not room for that cranial fluid, but that is what's said in the anatomy books, and I'm sorry, I disagree with that. I think the same as everywhere else in the body, for the CBD, that CBC, this very central place of us, of our brain, it has this extra nutrition, that oxygen, that glucose goes into the thalamus, feeds the pituitary gland, feeds the hypothalamus, feeds the pineal gland, feeds all of those the roots of all of the cranial nerves, feeds the root of the spine, the same as everywhere else in the body. The nutriments come out of the blood, and in a minute place, it's so tiny you can't even see it, comes out, it gets used, goes back into the venous blood and lymph, and goes back to the heart. And I think it's exactly the same in this central. There is the nutriments coming out of the blood and the detoxification of the venous blood, taking away the toxins. And then there's this extra, the whole choreplexus, it will be taking in toxins and ventilating the whole area, and it will be giving out these nutriments, and I think those are for the center of our being there, in the center of our brain. So it gives it extra ventilation, it gives it extra oxygen, and we'll just look at a few pictures of that. So here is a picture of the, now I can't see it again, but this is the lateral ventricles, and this is the third ventricle inside. Now can you see this beak area here? And it comes down, somewhere around here will be the pituitary gland and the optic nerve. I always looked at that and I thought, well, what is that? To me, it looks like the cranial fluid is flowing down here, and it's flowing into the pituitary gland, it's flowing into the whole hypothalamus area and feeding it. It doesn't look like it's just going around there and flowing away and doing nothing. So I was looking at that picture and I thought that, and then if you look on the next bit, you can see that the cranial fluid is heavier than any other fluid in the body because it's 99% water. So you can see that in this picture. You can see like the cranial fluid. This is like a well for it. It sits into here with all of the oxygen, with all of the glucose and salts, and it feeds all of the centers of the hypothalamus. Can you see how it funnels down, then feeds the whole pituitary gland here, and then in the center of the beak here it comes down, and this is the optic nerve. You know, it needs a lot of nutrients. So for me, it does what it looks like. It becomes nutriments for the hypothalamus, becomes nutriments for the pituitary gland, it becomes oxygen and nutriments for the eyes and the optic nerve. And where it comes down behind the pons, here we have the fourth ventricle, again, I can't see it properly, but it's somewhere in this area here, and it's backing in to the cerebellum there. But notice all of these nerve stems from all of the cranial nerves, and at the bottom you've got the vagus nerve. They're all pressing up. This wall wraps around, and all of these nerve stems are pushing up against this back wall, where the choroid plexus is producing all of that oxygen, all of that glucose. And you'd have to be mad to think that they wouldn't just absorb that and take that away on their journeys. And as I show in the articles describing how the cranial sea flows off down the nerves, the myelinating glial cells produce capillaries that actually draws it away and along the nerves. So not only will it flow out and feed them, just the pull of the nerves and the pull of these capillaries will draw out those nutriments for their journey. There it is. You can see it's a triangle. It's in this area here. And you've got all of the nerves, all of the nerve roots butting right up against that back wall. You've got the choroid plexus running here that's actually part of that back wall. Now, half of the choroid plexus will open up into this ventricle. The other half will be opening up inside that whole area, inside the brain stem. Now, I don't think I'm going to have to find that other picture. See, I painted these knowing that 10 years later I'd have to use them in a seminar. And as I had loads of time on my hands, I just painted them all. Okay, let's look in here. Just find this extra. Oh, there it is. So, again in the books it's depicted this fluid flowing in the ventricles and around the brain, and it shows the brain as solid, like a fluid around it and a solid brain. Again, this is an optical illusion. This is like trying to deceive someone. The brain isn't solid. It's like soft jelly. My table, I just want to stop my table wobbling. I don't know why it's wobbling. It's the consistency of soft jelly. It's 90% water. The astrocyte cells have got these tentacles joining to everything. If they unsucked their tentacles from everything around, the brain would be fluid. That's the only thing holding the shape of the brain, is that they've stuck their tentacles to everything else. So if you look at the inside, see, it's an aqueous place. See, all of the brain cells are away from each other, connected by tentacles. You've got a ventricle here. The only difference between the ventricle and inside the brain is that there is no cells there. In the brain, the cranial sea is 99% water and then 1% glucose, salt and oxygen. In the ventricles, the cranial sea is 99% water, 1% oxygen and 1% glucose and salt. It is exactly the same. So calling it two different names just divides it again. Giving those names different jobs is ridiculous. They can't follow it. They can't tell where it's moving to. It is just a theory. And it doesn't serve, not only is it not true, it does not serve healers. It does not serve visualization. So I describe it, I've called it the cranial sea rather than two different fluids. It is food. It is for channeling light. It is oxygen. Okay, and. So you've got this wall there. You see that wall? This is to the ventricles, and that'll have the choroid plexus in it. These are cuboidal ependymal cells. They have got wide junctions between them. So cranial sea can just flow back and forth. It's one cell thick, big wide gaps, the fluid can flow through. So just to give you a better description of this, I might be going into too much detail, but I've got these pictures here and I spent so much time painting them, you're going to have to listen. So here we have some cuboidal ependymal cells. So they are cubes and they've got the nucleus is there. Now the whole lining of all of the ventricles, they all fit together, the lateral ventricles, the third ventricle in the thalamus, the fourth ventricle behind the pons and medulla, and then what I call the fifth ventricle right down the center of the spine. They're continuous cuboidal ependymal cells. Then that continues and that makes the whole surrounding of the choroplexus. Now in the ventricles, wide open gaps, completely porous, makes up the choroplexus, and all of the junctions become tight junctions that will only let pure water through it, and that is what filters out the cranial fluid from the blood, because it can't, only water can go through those junctions, and the cells, the cuboidal ependymal cells, they let through oxygen, glucose, salt, water will flow through everything. That's what creates the cranial sea. So the lining of it is completely porous. The choroplexus tight, creating the cranial sea. Now the choroplexus is sitting around the thalamus. So on one side of the choroplexus is opening up into the ventricles, but in exactly the same way on the inside of it, without any other membranes, it's opening up directly inside here into the cells of the thalamus. So there's just nothing. It is in, that fluid is being created into the thalamus, into the pons, into the medulla oblongata. And as it goes in there, those cells will use up the oxygen, they will use up the glucose, they use the salt for firing the nerves, the energy down the nerves. It's crazy to think that that would not happen. So the CBC and the choroplexus, again, it doesn't show it in the books. It just shows fluid coming out of the choroplexus. It shows nothing flowing back in, because if it showed anything flowing back in, their theory couldn't work. Half of the job of the choroplexus is to produce the cranial sea. A similar amount of fluid is flowing back into it, carrying carbon dioxide, carrying neurotoxins, different toxins, in the same way as every other capillary in the brain is giving out oxygen, glucose and salt, and taking away carbon dioxide and toxins. The choroplexus is giving out nutriments and taking away toxins. So this whole central part of the brain is surrounded by the choroplexus, and for me is part of the CBC. So rather than detaching that and saying, oh, the choroplexus is part of the ventricles, which is part of the brain, and completely detaching it from this central part, what I'm saying is it's around this central part, it's feeding it, the fluids are all flowing into that central part, it's extra drainage, it's extra nutriments. Then you get the universal intelligence moving down through from the, sorry if I'm knocking people out here because we're getting more information through it. So from from the whole cerebrum, if I'm the CBC, you've got the whole cerebrum up here, you've got all of the cranial, the nerve fibers coming down, they're all coming into the neck area and down through here. Then from behind me, my back, coming around the whole chest area, you've got all the nerves coming in and joining in through the chest and all joining into the spine. So you get this communication up here. Then this bit, the only nerves connecting to here is from the eyes, and they come from the visual part of the brain back here around the thalamus, cross and mismatch in front, and then go off to the eyes. So the only nerves into here are from the eyes. The rest of it is disconnected from all around. The only connection is water. It's far more. If you include the lateral ventricles around it, the third ventricle in the middle of it is probably 3/4 water or more. So this whole central complex, where this seat of our consciousness is cranial C. It's mainly cranial C and the higher cortexes of the workings of our body. So, you know, nerves will flow up and down through it, but majorly its connection to everything around is through light intelligence, its connection to the higher self. The pineal gland is made of a crystalline structure for light. So the whole thalamus and this area, and then around it you've got the lateral ventricles around it, you've got the water in the middle. It is all water that the light can travel as intelligence through the water, and then that can disseminate rather through synapses through the brain. It just travels out as light intelligence directly through the water, directly through the whole central area, directly back and forth with the cerebellum, down through the waters of the spinal cord, out through the waters and capillaries of the cranial nerves, out through the capillaries of all of the nerves. So you get this, the thalamus is not connected by the nerves to the rest of the brain, but it's connected by light intelligence. And then this is connecting up through the crown chakra up here and then into the beyond. So you get the light coming in here, and you get the karma coming up through the whole body and turning to light in here and getting communicated home. So this is a light being at the top, and it's connected to the body. To disconnect it here, you cut someone's head off, they're really not going to be very healthy. So if you call this bit the brainstem and that bit the thalamus as two separate things, you're doing a real disservice to how you visualize things. And then you disconnect that from this light energy moving through the waters, doing another big disservice to yourself. So it is one whole area, one whole organism, then connecting out to the cerebrum, connecting out to the cerebellum, connecting out through the cranial nerves, through the face, through the vagus, and through. So it's all one organism. Okay, well, now I know why I had so much pent-up energy coming up to this webinar. So that is what we're working with.